Good afternoon. Hi. I'm Daniel Hilton, Head of News at Middle East Eye, and it's my great pleasure to introduce this incredibly distinguished panel of experts for this discussion on Israel and Palestine and what the future holds. All of our speakers today are titans of peace building and mediation with decades of experience in the Middle East and Palestine and Israel in particular. They are the people in the room, the figures that are speaking to all sides and working tirelessly on an issue that, with the war in Gaza, is perhaps looking more intractable than ever before. On my far right is Salman Sheikh. Salman is the founder and CEO of the Sheikh Group, a specialized peace-building organization dedicated to mitigating and resolving violent conflict with a focus on the Middle East and North Africa. He spent extensive time in Gaza, and he worked for the UN in Lebanon during Israel's 2006 invasion of the country. We also have Daniel Levy. Daniel is president of the US Middle East Project, focusing on de-escalation and conflict resolution in the Middle East with an emphasis on Palestine-Israel. Daniel was an Israeli peace negotiator, participating in the Oslo Accords. He also co-founded J Street, the prominent Jewish group in the United States that advocates for peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And I'm also delighted to introduce Gabrielle Rifkind. Gabrielle is director of the Oxford Process, an independent preventative diplomacy initiative. She is a group analyst, specialized in conflict resolution, and a mediator. Gabrielle comes at peace building from a psychological background, and she has a passion for marrying the psychological with geopolitics. As we gather here today, a war is raging in Gaza. It's been 9 months since the horrific 7th of October Hamas-led attacks in Israel, with more than 1,100 people killed, and the subsequent Israeli assault in Gaza has been almost beyond comprehension. All around 38,000 Palestinians have been killed. On top of that, Save the Children estimates 21,000 Palestinian children are missing entirely. Now, I'm sure everybody will be eager to hear your thoughts on ending this conflict and indeed a greater resolution further down the line. But before we do, I wondered, Daniel, if you could tell us a bit about the state of play in Palestine and Israel and the peace process before the 7th of October, especially considering your background with the Oslo Accords, which has provided so much of the architecture with which the West in particular views the conflict.
Yeah, someone's going to have to be answerable for Oslo as well. So I think one of the ways it's really important to think about this, Daniel, and first let me thank you for having us here at the Bradford Literary Festival and people who've taken their Saturday afternoons to be in this session. Is to wrap one's head around the idea that October 6th was a relatively normal day for Israelis. There's a permanent belligerent occupation of the Palestinians and denial of Palestinian rights going on for decades, and Israelis could go about their business with that having very little impact on their lives and on the ability of that country to function effectively within international relations, the international diplomatic system, the international trade system, its relations to the global economy, its ability to participate across the board in anything, from Eurovision to the Olympics to European soccer, etc. October 6th was anything but a normal day for Palestinians. Denied their most basic rights and freedoms, and I could carry on with the litany of those things, but I think people understand what I'm getting at. And that is an abnormal situation in itself, but it had been normalized, which isn't to justify October 7th's formula for challenging that abnormality. But it is to say something was fundamentally wrong here, that we were so deep into the idea that this is okay. And in fact, people like myself were almost patronized and dismissed. Oh, you still work on Israel-Palestine. Couldn't you find something grown up to do? Because this is going nowhere. It's manageable. You keep telling us that this is a situation that cannot be left like this. Because if you block every avenue to Palestinians for redressing this fundamental denial of their rights, a system, a situation that not only Palestinian academics, activists, and human rights groups had designated as meeting the legal definition of apartheid. Apartheid is a crime which has a legal definition associated to it. It doesn't mean that it has to be a one-to-one parallel with South Africa. But not only had Palestinians made that designation, but Israel's blue-chip human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International on the global stage, had made that designation. And here we were deep into a Potemkin peace process, the expiration date of Oslo. Oslo starts being implemented in 1994. It has a 5-year horizon for resolving all issues. That expired a quarter century ago. Just let that sink in. The modalities were now entrenched and embedded, and they became modalities not for ending occupation and creating Palestinian statehood, but for making permanent and for creating an entire control and governance system to prevent the attainment of deoccupation, Palestinian equality, freedom, liberation. So where we were was that not only had Israel's Western allies embedded themselves and promoted the prolongation of this apartheid reality, but we had reached a point where Israel was now establishing formal diplomatic relations with states in the region, premised on the continuation of that. And the last thing I'd say is that we reached a situation where you had people in the Israeli governing coalition who didn't say, "How dare you make that analogy? How dare you call us apartheid?" People like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, and inside Netanyahu's party, the Likud governing party, who wear their support for eradicating, displacing Palestinians as a badge of pride. And that government was welcomed in this country, in the United States. For decades, Israel had tried to join the visa waiver program, right? So Israelis wouldn't need a visa to go to the US. The Biden administration confers on the Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, Smotrich coalition the visa waiver. That backdrop, and many of us actually said, look, yes, the Israelis have got this managed, but it's a terrible situation. But many of us did start to warn that the extent of the provocative intent of that current coalition meant that this was far more fragile. That, I would argue, was the reality on the eve.
Thank you. Salman, in the short term, we have to end the conflict in Gaza. As Daniel said, there are parties in the Israeli government that sort of desperately want to resettle Gaza. You know, Smotrich, Ben Gvir, people within the Likud. How do you see a day after in Gaza? What does that look like, and how do we get there?
You know, I was asked that question in November last year. By the way, thank you so much. It's lovely to be here at the Bradford Literature Festival. It's the first literature festival I've been to anywhere in the UK, and I just think it's magnificent. So congratulations to everyone, and thank you all for, as Daniel said, for sparing your Saturday afternoon. So first of all, I was asked that question in November last year, and I said, I'm not going to engage in this discussion on the day after, because what we see ahead of us are just hours and days of hell. And at that moment, I'm really sorry to say I was right. Subsequent to that, it has become apparent that if we don't now have a plan, yes, in terms of how Palestinians can start to regain their lives and be protected, and Gazans can be protected, in Gaza and be able to govern themselves and have the security both for themselves and for those on their border, we're not going to be able to move forward even in the short term. I would concede now that is, but what worries me is that there is no joined up plan. I'm not giving any secrets away. There are different views even within, I think, the Biden administration, that there is an effort to try and bring them together on issues related to governance, security, and reconstruction. Something of what we see in that UN Security Council resolution, which was finally passed a few weeks ago. But I want to make a more fundamental point, which is that we won't really get to the day after if this logic, that this belief that you can somehow destroy Hamas through a military means. There is no military solution to this conflict. There never has been. Now, you said that that I was in Lebanon in 2006. At that time, it was a difficult war, Hezbollah and Israel. But at that time, we had an American administration led by President Bush with the Secretary of State Condi Rice, which after the initial 2-3 days of shock and confusion, did manage to put some guardrails on the Israeli cabinet, led by Ehud Olmert, with the foreign minister Tzipi Livni. And I'm sure most Lebanese would not thank me for saying, because it was still a very difficult war for the Lebanese. But because of that guardrails, and as Israel didn't make any real progress, we started to see serious diplomatic efforts and then behind the scenes efforts to try and taper off that conflict, which then led to UN Security Council Resolution 1701, the cessation of hostilities, which is still alive today because of now the dangers we see with regards to Lebanon. We can come back to that later. In the case of Gaza, there's been no such thing. So this mantra of Israel has the right to defend itself has now gone as far, including, I'm afraid, politicians here, as well as in other parts of the Western world, led by the US, which somehow have given a green light to somehow thinking that there can be a military solution to this. Those of us who've lived in Gaza, those of us who know it, knew full well that that wasn't going to be the case. And by the way, it's not 2020 hindsight. Some of us made that point in the first week of this starting, and to people, very senior people. And yet, there seems to be a psychosis which has developed, maybe born out of sort of a military occupation and trying to justify it over so many years, that somehow has led us to a situation where we're still trying to make some sort of excuses. So now we have limited pinpoint operations, which are anything but, and the use of weaponry, which is some of the most destructive that we have available today. That cannot continue. So yes, we do need the day after, but we need first and foremost the political will to stop it. And there, I'm afraid, we're still lacking. And as I warned in November, just to finish, if we do not stop this, we will see how this becomes a bigger conflict. You know, in the last 25 years, I worked on, of course, Israel-Palestine, on Syria in the last 14 years. In Iraq, I was in and out of Iraq with the UN Secretary General, and of course the Gulf. What I am horrified to see is that all those conflicts are now coming together into one. And so we may only be in the sort of first, second chapter of this particular conflict scenario, and that is frightening, not least for the Palestinians in Gaza, as well as those in the West Bank, and those Israelis which have been affected, which is an increasing number.
I wonder if there's any way that all of you sort of feel that we can sort of change the mindset in Israelis and in their Western backers that a military solution is not the right way to go.
Shall I start? Yeah. Okay, I don't think you've chosen us as a panel for our differences. I think you're going to find us all building on each other and nodding. So what I would start, because I come from a psychological background and have worked in conflict resolution in the Middle East for the last 2 decades and have always been committed to the idea that conflict cannot just be resolved through power, but it's also about people and human relationships. And things like marginalization and humiliation are often a very, very powerful driver of conflict. Now, at this point, what we've got is, at the height of war, it's very difficult to think about peace. And we see this in all conflicts. The longer the war goes on, the deeper the dehumanization, turning the other side into the enemy, and the harder it is to actually hold on to, can there be another phase? Now, we can't talk about the symmetry of suffering, because Daniel quite rightly told us that 38,000 Palestinians have been killed. But nevertheless, both sides are very traumatized. And often in that state, it's hard to imagine to the future. So if you took a poll now in either society, you would find very, very few people who were in the right state of mind for peacemaking. However, I think it's worth us thinking that, there are, if you look at the Yom Kippur War, which was in 1973, and as far as Israel was concerned, that was an existential fear about whether they would actually survive. Within 3 years, Sadat had come to Jerusalem. Within 5 years, there was a peace treaty. Yes, a cold peace, but nevertheless, an end of violence. So I think if we're talking about peace, there's been many, many solutions on the table, whether it's 1 state, 2 states, a confederation, how you get to the end of the tunnel. The issue is often not even the technicalities, but is there a vision, either how people are going to live separately or together in some kind of way without violence? Now, at the moment, and you both referenced it, Israel mindset has been, if we show that we, by our military strength, that we will show them, they used to talk about mowing the lawn, that we have more power and we're in control, and this is what they call deterrence. But in fact, there will be no end of conflict, and it's also a misunderstanding that might be state to state, the notion of deterrence. But when you've got an occupied people with a boot on their head, there is nothing that actually will stop the resistance. And however hard you hit at people, even if you get temporary quiet, people will not give up their entitlement to freedom. And so, we could go into how will we create this state of mind. It will take leadership, and we will come back and we will talk about leadership and what that would mean. But it would take the kind of leadership, and it's not going to happen in the immediate, when both sides start speaking the language again, because there was a little glimmer during Oslo. And in fact, a senior Palestinian we worked with for a long time, I suspect you all work with, he would say, at Oslo, we were throwing olive branches at each other. Now, Oslo had many, many problems, but nevertheless, there was a state of mind in which people believed they could live together. And unless there's a way we get there, we will just see endless scenarios like we're seeing now.
Gabrielle, as you mentioned, Israeli society is deeply traumatized by the 7th of October. If you watch Israeli TV, they're not really showing any pictures of what's going on in Gaza, and they've blocked Al Jazeera, but they're sort of relitigating the 7th of October again and again and again. And actually the captives, Hamas almost took Israeli society captive, hostage as well, because they can't get past it whilst all these people are held in these tunnels, like the ones that are still alive. Do you feel like the leadership that can bring Israelis together in a way that they can sort of address Palestine and Palestinians humanely can come internally from within Israel, or does that need to be fostered and helped along from the outside?
Well, it's a difficult one, isn't it? It's like how much pressure. You know, for example, if the US had stopped the military support, would there have been a ceasefire? But, and you know, it's worth discussing whether it's external pressure that gets you to peace or whether societies have to work out together how they are going to coexist in some way without violence. In fact, all of us, I suspect, spent quite a bit of time talking to Hamas, and many of them for a long time would talk about Hudna, which was a long-term ceasefire. And actually, psychologically, it made a lot of sense to me, because once people stop killing each other and you have a period without violence, you can humanize again and begin to imagine how you're going to live together. Now, with the kind of violence that is going on, that is not possible. But your question to me, I answered it. Is it external, or will it happen within the societies? Well, I mean, there were moments. Someone like Rabin built the trust with Arafat, where they began to talk about a common vision. We're a long way from that now. But one has to hope and believe that humanizing relationships is possible. And certainly what I know from my own background, often the worse it is, people only change when it's so awful that they have to do something.
Because Israeli society is traumatized by what happened. And that's very real. And there's another phenomenon, which is the manufactured maintenance of trauma. And that is also very real. And you guys at Middle East Eye do a lot of translation of things on the Israeli media, which I think has actually provided a service to people. And this is a one and the same time, a free media space, increasingly under one kind of ownership, but that's another story, a free media space and a mobilized and quite controlled media space. And reliving trauma has almost become the go-to place for Israel throughout the decades, where you reach a situation where the huge part of the Israeli Jewish population, which is not coming from Ashkenazi European roots, for whom Holocaust is a learned thing, almost internalizes it as a lived thing. And it's used and turned against people who had no role in that. Where this takes me is that I think not only is there trauma, but there is also confusion and despair inside Israel, because they are learning in the harshest way, not nearly as harsh as what is happening to Palestinians in Gaza, but Israelis are learning the limits of military force, and this is counterintuitive to the national narrative. And this is actually what asymmetric warfare in an asymmetric conflict by a resistance movement is all about. You turn the superior firepower of your enemy not on itself in terms of the direct military blowback, but on itself in terms of the exaggerated use of that force and what it does to that society and what it does to everyone else watching and going, Jesus, wow, are they really doing this? Now, Palestinians have a right to resist. They don't have a right to violate international law when they're doing so. Israel has a right, it has a responsibility to provide security for its people. It doesn't have a right to violate international law and be in violation of the ICJ and the ICC, etc., when it does so. That is, I would argue that there is a possibility that a part of Israeli society is trying to work these things through and will wake up from the hangover or whatever, and will say what new approaches are available. But I would also argue that the prospects of that happening and being generated from within exclusively are slim. And the responsible thing to do, if you are the outside actor with a significant impact on that, the responsible thing to do is how do you carry that on a certain journey. Unfortunately, the irresponsible thing to do is what is being done by Israel's main supposed friends, because I am passionate about justice and rights for Palestinians. I'm also passionate about the fact that the Israeli Jewish community is not going to know a better future unless it can get out of the business of oppressing Palestinians, because you're never going to have security that way. And I think it's a disaster for many different communities in this country, including the Jewish community in this country, by the way. But I would argue that the responsible thing to do from the outside is to create the maximum prospect in which Israelis will see that this is not working for them. And what the US and the UK and others have done is sent the message, it's okay. 38,000 dead, we'll continue to send the weapons. To hell with the fact that our public opinion is in a totally different place. And I'm not saying that Israelis can be bludgeoned by sanctions into changing path, but I am saying that if you are treated with the kind of impunity, the absence of accountability that Israel is treated with, then change is very unlikely, because you look at the cost-benefit calculation, and what is on the cost side is exclusively what can be generated by Palestinians, and in this case, in a military sense. Rather than, and this is where I think it's relevant to think in South African terms, in terms of the costs that were generated, and in terms of the internalizing in a population that why do all these people think it's not normal? Why can't our rugby team go on tours? I'm talking now about that historic example. Why do they think it's not normal? There must be something wrong with them. There must be something wrong with them because of who we are, because we're Jewish. There must be something wrong with them. It goes on, and then you begin to say, yeah, there may be something wrong with them, but is it possibly the case that there's something wrong with what we're doing as well? And you begin to have a different conversation inside your own society. And the very worst thing you can do from the outside is send the signal, it's okay, this is normal, because then you do not see the people you are doing this to. And I think that's the story pre-October 7th. Part of how we got to this level of dehumanization of Palestinians is because Israelis didn't see Palestinians, because there was no cost or consequence to the occupation. And that's the story of Israel's allies and the US and the UK and the West.
Amen.
So look, I think, trying to build on what my friends have said here, and also linking again to your question of the day after, Israeli society still, despite the trauma, probably has a default. And the default is to try and establish control again. And that's what Netanyahu is offering when it comes to Gaza and the day after. The piecemeal control of Gaza, the division of Gaza, the placement of large population centers, which the majority of which are women and children, in small pockets of land. Some people, I wouldn't do that, but some people call them concentration camps. And it's just going to be a war of attrition against such a population. Still hoping, or at least trying to present that there is a military way of controlling the situation. Now, that is a horrible thing to think about. Not for 1 month, but it could be another year, 2 years, God knows how long. And again, in terms of Israel's friends, they're just not doing enough to avert that. And without speaking, I'm sorry, too openly, That is what I feel is still going on in Western capitals, in accepting de facto that state of affairs, even if they don't want it, and even if they declare they don't want it, even if it's in a UN resolution now as well. You know, in 1999, I was in Sierra Leone with the UN. We visited in Freetown an amputee camp, majority of which by the rebels had limbs cut off. Well, Gaza today now is the largest amputee camp, especially for children in the world. And if that doesn't stop this mayhem, then I don't know what will. There is a way forward, but it requires now a very dramatic change. The problem is the electoral cycle doesn't help. Now, we're heading into a very consequential week or so, where, of course, we will have elections here. We will also have a runoff in Tehran, and we will have French presidential elections too. I just hope that things don't get worse until we have a new president, or whoever that is, on January the 20th, 2025. And yet that's what we're facing. And to Israel's friends, and I think they know it, but we have to say it loudly, Israel has not been more insecure today than since its inception. It has never been as insecure as this. So why are we still going down this route? Why are we not able to build on a narrative which first humanizes the Palestinians and means it and stops this? Also, something we haven't mentioned yet, gets those hostages out and gets the bodies of those who have been killed back to their families as well, and then start to give ourselves a space in which to work with these deeply traumatized societies.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more point about trauma. The State of Israel, in part, was founded on the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews were killed. Now, I think in the Israeli mentality, one of the consequences of that was never again will we passively go to our death. And so what then happened is they built up this very powerful military. And their identity is about, we will show this is a tough neighborhood, and that we will show them we're in control. But there lies the painful paradox, because the more they do that, whether they do it in Lebanon with Hezbollah or they do it in Gaza, what happens is you just get the deeper roots of more hatred and a desire to hit back. There are a few voices who do understand this. I actually spoke to Ami Alon, but unfortunately, although he headed Shin Bet and is now no longer in power, he was saying until Israelis realize that there will, like you said, there will be no security whilst an occupation continues, and to reiterate, we have a boot over their head, because that is what nobody will tolerate. And there hasn't been sufficient click on that in Israel. And until that happens, you will not get a political change.
Can I pull something Salman and everyone said together, which is why I think it is terrifying and horrifying enough what has happened, but that it could get worse, because it's as you say, Israel has never felt so insecure. And as you said, Gabriel, that
Not even felt, I believe
is. I agree. And the thing there is, you therefore double down on trying to reassert a deterrence, which you cannot achieve in that way. And one of the problems Israel has is that other people smell weakness, because they are demonstrating weakness. They're not winning, and Hamas is the least powerful of the resistance Axis forces. Now, I don't think Israel is brought down in that way. But this is where, if anyone was serious about saying we care about Israel, This is exactly where you would try and walk it to a place where you're not continuously doubling down on a losing bet and on a very dangerous bet. And I want to say one other thing, because you mentioned and of course that's not going to be how you get the hostages out. That's not going to be how you get people back to their homes in Israel, let alone, of course, how you get the people who are under the rubble, how you begin to get Gaza out of a place of daily mass civilian killing events, where you deal with the humanitarian crisis that this has created. The other thing you referenced, which it's important for me to pick up on, because what people see at the moment is, and I think it's interesting and it's perplexing to many people, a real fight inside my community, inside the Jewish community, and our community. And a lot of that derives from never again. Yeah. Is it never again us, or is it never again, full stop, universalist as a way of living? And what many of us took to be axiomatic, which is never again means never again for anyone, has been proven not axiomatic, and we're not willing to shut up. And we do not believe that actual existing Zionism in practice is doing what's written on the tin for Jews, which is delivering a more secure future, let alone doing that for anyone else. And that's not going to go away. And people will hopefully deal with it more effectively in the politics of this country and in the politics of other places, because the way it's being dealt with is also feeding into divisions in this country. And, that's a bad place to be.
Yeah. Briefly, before we go to the floor for questions, I think we've spoken quite a lot about Israeli society, but I think we should speak about Palestinian society as well, and Palestinian politics. And so, it's an incredibly fractured scene. The leaders in the West Bank are often seen as venal collaborators. Hamas are sort of persona non grata in the West. But what I want to say, Gabrielle, maybe you can address this. What do you make of suggestions that Hamas should be integrated within the PLO and part of a kind of broader Israeli political scenario? And do you think that there's any Palestinian figure that could be seen as a uniting figure in the way that Abu Mazen isn't?
Yeah, that's the question for me.
Well, that's the way probably to discredit it.
It's where my mind is at the moment. I think it's inevitable in some way Hamas will be part of a political process, because you can't get rid of an idea, an ideology. A military wing will definitely be weakened. I think we've all been thinking about the idea of leadership and what that could look like. And actually something I've began to do is, I don't have to keep this private, is to talk to Arab Barghouti, who is the son of Marwan Barghouti. Now, Marwan Barghouti has resided in a Israeli prison for the last 22 years. For some, he's the new Mandela. For others, he has blood on his hands. What we would say, probably all of us, is everybody in this conflict who's been involved in the war has blood on their hands. And somehow, if a state has blood on its hands and a non-state actor uses violence, there's a kind of, there's no kind of recognition that actually, in some ways, this interaction is inevitable. Nevertheless, why Marwan Barghouti is to be thought about, and we don't know how it would play out. He actually calls for a two-state solution. Now, it's not necessarily, we don't even know what the solution will look like. We referenced that before, it's a confederation or one state or whatever. But he has a vision and he speaks the language of a future. And there is not enough voices who are doing this. And so in the end, he also, in terms of polling, he actually, if there were elections now, and there was Abbas, Sinwar, Mustafa Barghouti, he still comes out with about 67% of the population saying they'd support him. They wouldn't support him for long if nothing happened. So, you have to ripen the conditions. You have to think about what happened with Mandela. There were lots and lots of conversations. But nevertheless, leadership on both sides, people who carry vision, will be a crucial piece of a way through. And very, very tragically, we've seen an absence of that.
Someone who wanted to say something?
Yeah, just briefly. I think the fundamental principle here is that Palestinians should be given the space in which to build their unity in the leadership, and that we have the principle of one governed territory, which includes the West Bank and Gaza, and not necessarily for it to be divided into two. Now, all that is easier said than done right now. We have to be honest, if there was a ceasefire tomorrow, it's going to be a really hard job for a Palestinian entity without that unity to be able to take on this role and have the credibility and the strength to be able to resist all the pressures that will come on it, especially with regards to Gaza. I've said this before, and Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas is a dear friend, but there is a need for a change of leadership in Palestine. You've had one attempt which Western governments have tried to support, which is a technocratic government. That's partly been undermined by those in the Israeli cabinet who try to cut off funds to the Palestinian Authority. But more than that, it's been undermined internally as well. That cannot continue as such. Good people with good backgrounds, but who are, first of all, proving to be rather ineffective in very difficult conditions, but also because of the internal disunity that there is on the Palestinian side. I also agree, of course, Hamas has to be part of such an entity and of a PLO which is truly representative of the Palestinian people. One of the saddest things is that you have these daily killing events, and yet there isn't one Palestinian strong, unified voice which is able to command the respect and the authority that it needs at this point in time to represent those Palestinians. And that's not a situation, in my view, that can continue.
But let's be clear that everything that was just described, the absence of that unified voice, all that, it's not a bug. It's a feature. It's a design. This isn't a coincidence. Oh, what a shame. First of all, from the Israeli side. Sure. Israel, no, I'm not saying you won't say no. But from the Israeli side, who gets to live just on that most blatant level? Who is not imprisoned versus who is imprisoned? Who is blackmailed? This is, the occupied territories are the most surveilled. We're all pretty surveilled. But this takes surveillance.
Speak for yourself.
I suggest you take my word for it. And so what we have at this stage is a Palestinian authority designed to serve the maintenance of the occupation. You cannot have an authority that's been there for 30 years, that has a security force trained by the people who provide the weapons to Israel, created in order to protect Israelis from Palestinians, the remittances that are Palestinian but are held and sent through Israel. So Israel has all this leverage. The West keeps them in place because they are convenient, and this is hardly new. I mean, it's not like it's just a bit that this is what we have in the third decade of the 21st century. But, this is colonial management 101. So this is what it is designed to do, and it will have to break free from those things. Now, I think it would be really wise, again, for those who are backing this up, to recognize that the design flaw means this can't even do what it's supposed to do, let alone challenge this status quo. But, I think Palestinians are going to have to seize this space for themselves. And they are, and there are many things going on, but in really hard circumstances.
Yeah, I just add one thing. I completely agree that it's sort of been a policy of Israel to have divide and rule. But I think there's a bigger issue that is a real struggle about how secular and religious groups actually live together. And I think that's as true in Palestinian society as it is true in Israeli society. And I sometimes think we should forget the notion of the nation state and put the secular groups together and the religious groups together in the immediate. I don't mean that, and I certainly don't mean that in this I don't mean that in this country. But there's certainly an issue within both societies that there is not enough respect and understanding of the radical differences and how to live with the other. And that's quite a big one.
I can see there is a hand here, and let's take a couple, and I'll sort of like move from the front backwards, if that's okay. So this lady here, you can start with her.
Hello, thank you for speaking. This has been very interesting. Firstly, just a point is when we talk about hostages, I'd really appreciate, and I don't hear enough of this, when, of course, we all want the hostages back from Israel, but, from Palestine, but like, Israel has held hostages who are Palestinians for decades, and I call them hostages because they're literally abducted from the street and whatever. So going forward, I'd really appreciate if we could say that yes, we want hostages back from Palestine, but we also want them back from Israel, and in the thousands. And my second point was going to... Oh my God, I'm so nervous, I forgot.
Strong first point.
But yeah, I'd really like to, when you do speak and answer questions, to really talk about the Palestinian hostages and children.
And sorry, gentlemen, would you like to just say something?
Thank you. Thank you for that. Really enjoyed what you had to say. Question really is about asking you how optimistic you are for the future. We've heard a lot, and you've talked very eloquently about what should happen, what needs to happen. But certainly myself, looking ahead and looking what's coming out of the States in the election, if Trump gets elected in particular, what pans out as what might happen in France, I cannot see the West pulling back. And the power of the arms lobby, the power of the Israeli lobby, I can't see it getting better, but I'd really appreciate your views on how optimistic you are. Thank you.
Gabrielle, how optimistic are you?
It's funny, I kept thinking, Daniel, are you going to ask us if there's a way through?
Yeah.
Because I think we have to hold on to the idea. And it's not really about how optimistic or pessimistic. I don't think one can be a responsible citizen and just give way to pessimism. There are ways through. In fact, one of the interesting ideas that I did want to mention, and it's just taking seed, but it would need a lot of momentum behind it and people buying in. It is, hang on, am I getting it right? It's called something, a new initiative called Land for All. And why that's interesting is it sort of deals with the notion of two states and one state. So people stay where they are. A lot of people will find that a very difficult idea. But you're actually responsible to the geography of where you decide to live. So if you're a settler, and there have been conversations with the Palestinian government about some of the settlers staying there. Some of them are economic settlers, but if not, the ones who want to carry on the violence, they go back to Israel. But the point is, people stay where they are, and in the end, to begin with, you have a border between. But over time, when the violence has stopped, that border comes away, and they become some kind of confederation. I mean, I don't know whether either of you think that there's anything in this, but it means, but it's only possible to even think about it if there becomes a vision of how do two people commit to learning to live together.
To your point, your first point. So I think it's important It's used as shorthand, and shorthand can be illuminating, it can be obfuscating, and I think you're right. There are prisoners of war, so people who are being held in uniform, who were soldiers, maintaining the pre-October 7th blockade on Gaza, I think should be seen as prisoners of war. Palestinians are held as political prisoners, I would say. Sometimes as hostages, sometimes in administrative detention without trial, and you're right on all of those. I agree with Gabriel. I'm not on the optimism versus pessimism. I think we have seen a change that could drive something transformational, which means that I'm not as depressing as these times are, right? I'm not without hope. One of the reasons that the answer to the question Daniel asked about what about on the Palestinian side is so important, because I think it's really hard to crystallize this around something if you haven't got a Palestinian unified national movement that can lead this, which is why so much effort is being invested into making sure that thing does not exist. Because that can especially use the forces that have emerged during this. What we've seen, for instance, the very negative picture I've portrayed of Israel's Western allies is not the same in the global majority, global South. So we've seen really interesting challenges and ways of trying to chip away at this impunity, like the South African case at the International Court of Justice, and other states have now joined that. Like some of the changes to trade relations. We haven't seen that in the Palestinian hinterland in the region. And I think one of the reasons that's not happening is you don't have a Palestinian side that can drive and lead and embarrass and cajole that into happening. And we see changes here. You know, if you see where public opinion is at, if you see where mobilization is at, and I think the question then becomes, where do we take that, and how do people who are mobilized impact places where power resides? And that's sometimes the long haul hard work which is hard to do. And I think sometimes people are leaning into the toxic politics and are doing things that just contribute to further toxicity, rather than actually trying to address, okay, how are we going to make changes where power resides? There is an election here in a few days. It matters where people are at. And I'm not going to get involved in local Bradford politics, but when accusations are hurled at someone like an MP, the other part of Bradford, like a Naz Shah, who is going to be one of those voices in Parliament that's trying to drive positive change, but they're being gone after in ways that I think doesn't movement build and doesn't try and build power where it needs to be built. Again, I don't want to lean too much into that, but I think those are important things. Where this all ends up, for me, we're not in a solution space. We're in a place where you have to change the incentive structure on the Israeli side, and then we can circle back to whether partition is the right way forward or not, etc.
Salman.
All right, let me try to be a little bit contrarian.
But you're pessimistic.
No, I agree. I'm not optimistic or pessimistic, though, given the work that we all do, you have to keep trying. So take that, whatever verb you want to use. I think you do have to have a destination, at least in the short term, and in terms of the longer term. So one, yes, there has to be a ceasefire today, tomorrow. There has to be accountability for what's already gone on, and all the other stuff for the shorter term. But I also think you do need a destination which ultimately Israelis and Palestinians will have to forge and agree on and decide. But for me, that destination is still the two-state solution. Okay, so I hate to be prescriptive in this case, but I I passionately believe that Israelis and Palestinians have to share this land, and yes, they may well choose to do it in another way. But given where we are and given where we're likely to be for quite some time, we have to be realistic in at least helping set a destination which at least many in the international community would support today. Some may disagree, but there are 57 OIC, Organization of Islamic Conference, and Arab League countries that would support a two-state solution today. And it's incredible to me that an Israeli leader, an Israeli government, is turning their back on something like that at this point in time.
Not sure if they
forward.
are.
Well,
They totally are.
they totally are.
They totally are. There's no one in the Zionist political spectrum
Yeah.
represented in Parliament who accepts a two-states as we recognise it.
exactly right.
Bantustan, where you pretend it's a Palestinian state, Allah
And,
Masahara,
and, there,
sure.
and therein
No,
lies
I
the
didn't
problem.
mean that. I meant in terms of wanting that regional relationship with the Arab states.
So let me just continue.
Yes, agree.
This is my former colleague at Brookings, when I used to be at the Brookings Institution, Margaret Macmillan, one of the best historians, I think, contemporary historians out there. She wrote this book of what came the 6 months after the end of the First World War. 6 months in Paris, where world leaders came together and they tried to hash out a way forward. Now, ultimately, they didn't succeed, but I do think that we... Sure. I don't disagree. And she dissects exactly the reasons for that. But I do believe, again, in working towards a destination, Palestinians cannot afford another day under occupation. So we have to work towards a destination as urgently as possible that ends that occupation. And as I said, the best consensus that I can find and that I hear, that I believe that leaders, as well as Israelis and Palestinians, so again, on both sides, that has to be built. That's why I talk about a destination, is a two-state solution. If we don't, I can imagine, yes, we may well have other ideas, but those Palestinians that I saw in those refugee camps in Gaza, which we promised in 2000, 2001, 2002, and 2003, who are now in their 20s, will be there with their children for another 20 years and another 30 years. And I'll tell you what, talking to senior American officials, and this I do believe them in, they also do believe those who would have the courage of their conviction, some of whom have now come out of the administration, by the way, this is the most plastic moment, they would say, that we've had in a very long time. Hamas's sort of brutal act on October the 7th has shaken the inertia. So if we don't set a destination and work towards it, and I would say in the course of a couple of years, 2-3 years, I'm afraid we are going to miss this particular opportunity. It's not being overly optimistic or utopian, but I believe that there is, out of this, an opportunity to try and work towards something else.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm terribly sorry, but we have no more time for questions. But thank you all for being here, and thank you so much to...
Thank you.